So we're all familiar with living in a time of political upheaval and turmoil. Um, and I've heard many people say, "Oh yeah, well it's like the '60s," but it's not. The '60s were actually much more divisive, believe it or not, to the point that in the 1960s there were riots. I mean, we've had riots too recently in the last few years, but there were riots and there were people who were actually bombing radio stations and burning down ROTC buildings and things like that. So it's not quite as violent now as it was then. Although we didn't have anybody actually attack the Capitol, they did actually try to levitate the Pentagon at one point. It didn't work, but at any rate, so we want to wonder the reason why. I think that the major theme here goes all the way back to World War II, and we think about at the end of World War II, the United States was the most powerful, the most prosperous economy, and the most successful country on earth. And here we are barely 20 years later, or a little over 20 years later, and the United States, some people have argued, is the least politically stable country on earth. And we have to wonder, well, how did that happen, right? And we've already talked about, the effect of the Cold War on the psyche in the United States and everywhere else. And also, the Red Scare, those things we talked about last week. And a lot of that actually ends up shaking people's confidence in the federal government. Okay. So we're already holding, I mean, Americans have always been suspicious of big government, and I think rightfully so, but in this case, Americans are really distrustful of what's happening in government, and the government is doing the right thing. And then we also talked about, sorry about that, we also talked about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, the way that we portrayed it last week, ends with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which seems like a great triumph, but in fact, what it did was it left open a great wound in American society between black and white, which we're still dealing with today. But after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, race relations got worse in the United States, not better. You guys watch that movie, City on Fire? Did you see that? What did you guys think of that? Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, I knew about the Detroit riots, but I didn't know how destructive they had been. And it was really kind of shocking to see all that destruction and how much tension there was between, the races and all that going on at the same time as the Detroit Tigers playing the ball game and all that stuff. Right. So it was pretty shocking to see that.
Right. Did you guys enjoy the movie? Was it? I thought it'd be something you would be interested in, mostly because of baseball. Because I don't know if you guys realize this, but baseball is the best game that's ever been devised. Right. So at any rate, that kind of demonstrates this racial divide between whites and blacks in the United States, right? And this is going to be something, a theme that carries through the 60s and into the 70s, really even today to a certain extent. Okay, so we have that, and then the main issue that we're going to be looking at for the 1960s is another kind of a political divide, which is liberals versus conservatives. Okay, so in liberals, what we mean by liberals in the 1960s is John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and their ideas of the role of the federal government in the lives of people. Okay, and this argument really goes back to the Depression and maybe even earlier, but particularly to the Depression. Johnson and Kennedy are going to carry into the presidency with them the idea of Franklin Roosevelt, that the purpose of the federal government is to ensure the welfare of the people of the United States. All right. The difference between Roosevelt and Kennedy, and particularly Johnson, is going to be that Roosevelt was addressing an economic crisis was happening at that time, and Johnson is going to be trying to reshape society in such a way that the federal government is seen as the protector of all the people, or the provider, I guess you could say, for all the people. And many people, conservatives, are going to see this as a violation of the original intent of the Constitution, because the original, from their point of view, the original intent of the Constitution is that the federal government is limited to doing only those things that the state governments can't do. So the federal government is limited by the Constitution to conducting foreign policy and regulating trade, regulating interstate commerce, and those sorts of things. And then everything else, education, infrastructure, everything else is left up to the states. Okay. And morality laws, everything is left up to the states. And that's the way conservatives think about it. Okay. So now when we think about this divide, then it kind of comes to the forefront after Kennedy's assassination and Johnson becomes president. Johnson wanted to be president. He wanted to run for president on his own. And Johnson thought that the best way to do that would be to carry out Kennedy's wishes for what would happen in the federal government, right? So he introduced a series of reforms called the Great Society programs. And the Great Society, the idea behind the Great Society programs is that the United States government, with all of its wealth and all of its power, should be able to create a society where there was no poverty, where there was no illiteracy, where there was no ill health. So the Great Society programs were designed to pull people out of poverty, put them to work, make sure that everybody had a good education, make sure that everybody had good health care. And you can't really deny that that was those were lofty goals, right? The problem, according to conservatives, was it was all unconstitutional, because the purpose, all those things should be handled by the states. They shouldn't be handled by the federal government. That's the way conservatives saw it. Okay, so these programs, some of those programs, we all kind of rely on, and Medicare, Medicaid. I think that's about it from that period. Education grants to colleges and schools and things like that all come from the Great Society programs, right? And you can kind of see their point. On the one hand, you could say, okay, well, the federal government actually sets the agenda for education in many cases in the United States. Okay, we have a Department of Education. Okay, but where in the Constitution does it say the federal government should have anything to do with education? It doesn't, right? So conservatives will say, well, the federal government is overreaching. How do they get away with it? Well, the way that they get away with it is they say, well, you don't have to do this, but if you don't, you're not going to get any of our money. You follow what I'm saying here? And so basically then, if you're an independent school district and you say, I don't want to teach what the federal government tells me to teach, that's fine, but then you're not going to get any money. And because the lure of the money is always so great, the federal government then is able to insert itself into education decision making. You guys follow what I'm saying here? Questions, comments about this? Okay, so now what that does is it creates a sense of by many people in the United States, the conservatives, that the federal government is out of control. It's too big. It's out of control, and we have to realize the people that feel this aren't just a bunch of right-wing nut jobs. This is what's being challenged is their fundamental understanding of what it means to be an American. And you have to keep in mind that people were actually taught at this time what it means to be an American. They had civics classes in school where you would go and you would learn how the government works and things like that, which we don't have that much of anymore. At any rate, the point here is that there is this divide